What if a single act of prejudice on a flight didn't just ruin someone's day, but dismantled a life and threatened to bring down an entire airline? We've all heard stories of nightmare passengers, but what happens when the flight attendant is the one causing the turbulence? This isn't just a story about a man being challenged for his first-class seat. This is the story of Damien Blackwood, a single father, a loving dad, and the secret CEO of the very airline he was flying. When a flight attendant publicly humiliated him, he fired her mid-flight. But what happened next, when the cameras were off and the real world hit back, is a story of karma, consequence, and a shocking twist that proves no story is ever as simple as it seems. The scent of recycled air and expensive leather mingled in the hushed cabin of Trans-American Flight 765 from LAX to JFK. It was a smell Damien Blackwood knew intimately, a fragrance that for years had meant sacrifice and success in equal measure. Today, however, it smelled of something new, a quiet, hard-won peace. Beside him, 7-year-old Zora, all bright eyes and beaded braids that clicked softly with every movement, was meticulously arranging her coloring pencils on the polished wood veneer of the console separating their pod-like seats in first class. Each pencil was a soldier in her rainbow army, and the white-capped peaks of the Sierra Nevadas, just beginning to peek through the clouds below, were the backdrop to her silent, colorful campaign. Damien, dressed in a simple, well-tailored gray Henley and dark jeans, watched her with a warmth that felt like sunlight spreading through his chest. At 42, he wore the kind of understated confidence that wealth often brings, but his was tempered by the exhaustion that only single parenthood could instill. There were faint lines of fatigue around his eyes, a roadmap of late nights spent closing deals and early mornings spent making pigtails. He had built his empire from the ground up, starting with a single, sputtering cargo plane and a vision. That vision had grown into Aura Airlines, a boutique carrier he'd acquired and rebranded 3 years ago, a company he was now the CEO of. It was a fact known to the board and a handful of senior executives, but not to the general public, and certainly not to the crew of this flight. He preferred it that way. He often flew his own airline incognito, a secret shopper at 30,000 feet, observing the real-time operations, feeling the passenger experience firsthand. It was the only way to truly know the soul of his company. Today, however, wasn't about business. It was the first real vacation he and Zora had taken since her mother, his beloved Lena, had passed away 2 years prior after a brutal fight with cancer. The trip to New York was for Zora. A week of Broadway shows, giant pretzels in Central Park, and a pilgrimage to the American Girl doll store. It was about replacing the ghosts of hospital waiting rooms with the vibrant chaos of a city that never slept. It was about creating new, happy memories that could stand as bulwarks against the encroaching tide of sadness. "Daddy, can I have some apple juice?" Zora whispered, her voice a small melody in the quiet cabin. "Of course, sweetie. Let me ask the flight attendant," Damien said, his eyes scanning the cabin. That's when he saw her for the first time. Her name, according to the small silver pin on her lapel, was Brenda. She was a woman in her late 50s, with a helmet of stiff blonde hair that looked like it had been sculpted rather than styled, and a mouth set in a permanent thin line of disapproval. She moved through the first-class cabin, not with the graceful efficiency Damien expected of his Aura cruise, but with a kind of territorial sourness, as if each passenger was a personal affront. She'd just finished a conversation with a man in a crisp suit across the aisle, her voice a syrupy, deferential coo, but as her eyes landed on Damien and Zora, the syrup curdled. Damien watched as her gaze flickered from his face to his daughter's, then down to their casual attire. He saw the subtle, almost imperceptible curl of her lip. It was a look he had seen 1,000 times in his life, in boardrooms where he was the only black man, in high-end stores where clerks followed him a little too closely. It was the look of instant, baseless judgment, the look that said, "You don't belong here." He chose to ignore it, offering a polite smile as she approached. "Excuse me, miss. When you have a moment, Could my daughter please have some apple juice? Brenda stopped, her hand on the back of an empty seat. She didn't return the smile. Her eyes, a pale, washed-out blue, held a chilly disdain. "The pre-departure beverage service has concluded," she said, her voice clipped and cool. "We'll begin the main service once we reach cruising altitude." Damien's smile didn't falter, though he felt a familiar, weary tightening in his gut. "I understand. It's just for my daughter. I'd be happy to pay for it." Brenda's eyes narrowed slightly. "It's not about payment, it's about procedure." She then leaned in, lowering her voice to a conspiratorial whisper that was somehow louder and more insulting than a shout. "Perhaps if you had boarded on time with the other first-class passengers, you wouldn't have missed it." They had boarded on time. They had, in fact, been among the first on the plane, waiting patiently as Zora carefully stowed her unicorn backpack. The insinuation was clear and deeply offensive. He could feel the eyes of the passenger across the aisle on them, the man Brenda had been so friendly with moments before. Damien felt a hot flash of anger, but he pushed it down, turning it into a cool, impenetrable calm. He would not let this woman with her petty prejudices ruin the first moments of this trip. He would not let her see him lose his composure in front of his daughter. "We were on time," Damien said, his voice even and low. "But that's all right. We can wait." He turned his attention back to Zora, who was now looking up at him, her coloring forgotten, a confused frown on her face. He gave her a reassuring wink. "The juice is on its way, sweetie. It's just taking the scenic route." Zora giggled, the tension in her small shoulders relaxing. But Damien could still feel Brenda's stare on the back of his neck. He didn't have to look to know she was still standing there, her judgment radiating like a cold front. This wasn't just about a missed drink service. It was a power play, a small act of aggression designed to make him feel unwelcome. He'd hoped Aura Airlines was better than this. He had staked his reputation and his fortune on creating a company that valued respect and dignity above all else. He had personally overseen the diversity and inclusion training. He had written the mission statement himself. And yet, here was the rot, in plain sight, wearing the uniform he had designed. As Brenda finally moved on, her heels clicking an angry rhythm on the cabin floor, Damien took a deep, slow breath. He had wanted a peaceful flight, a quiet start to a long-awaited vacation. But as he looked out the window at the endless expanse of blue, he had a sinking feeling that this journey was about to get very, very turbulent. And he, the man who owned the airline, was flying directly into the heart of the storm. The plane leveled off, and the seatbelt sign pinged off with a soft chime. The low hum of the engines became a backdrop to the renewed stirring of the cabin. For a while there was a fragile peace. Damien and Zora played a game of I Spy, their quiet laughter a small pocket of warmth in the chilled, sterile air of first class. Zora's apple juice eventually arrived, delivered by a younger, friendlier flight attendant named Carlos, who gave Zora a cheerful smile and an extra packet of cookies. Damien made a mental note of the young man's name, a stark contrast to the lingering bitterness Brenda had left in her wake. Damien had hoped that would be the end of it, a minor, unpleasant incident, a footnote in his ongoing, silent audit of his own company. But Brenda, it seemed, was not finished. She reappeared as the meal service was about to begin, clipboard in hand, her expression one of grim determination. She moved down the aisle, taking meal orders, her voice once again assuming its sycophantic tone for the other passengers. When she reached Damien's seat, however, the sweetness vanished, replaced by an icy formality. "I'll need to see your boarding pass," she said without preamble. Damien looked up from the in-flight magazine he'd been pretending to read. "I'm sorry." "Your boarding pass," she repeated, enunciating each word as if he were hard of hearing or intellectually slow. "There seems to be a discrepancy with the passenger manifest. I need to confirm you're in the correct seat." This was a direct escalation, a challenge not just to his presence, but to his very right to be there. The accusation hung in the air, thick and ugly. "You couldn't possibly have paid for this seat." The passenger across the aisle, a man named Henderson, according to the conversation Damien had overheard, was now openly staring, his face a mixture of curiosity and smug satisfaction. Damien felt that familiar heat rise in him again, but this time it was laced with a profound disappointment. This was his airline. His. The principles of hospitality and respect he'd championed were being trampled on, right before his eyes. "There's no discrepancy, I can assure you," Damien said, his voice dangerously quiet. "My daughter and I are in seats 2A and 2B. "I'll be the judge of that," Brenda retorted, her condescension hardening into open hostility. "Your boarding pass now." Zora, sensing the shift in tone, looked from Damien to the flight attendant, her lower lip beginning to tremble. She reached out and her small hand found his. Damien squeezed it gently, a silent promise that he would handle this, that she was safe. He reached into his leather carry-on, the one he'd bought in Milan on a business trip, and pulled out his phone. He calmly opened the airline's app, his app, and brought up their digital boarding passes. He held the screen out for her to see. Brenda barely glanced at it. Her eyes were fixed on his face, a triumphant glint in them. This wasn't about the seat. This was about dominance. It was about proving her initial ugly assumption correct. "These can be faked," she sniffed dismissively. "I'm going to need to see some identification to match the names, and perhaps the credit card you used to purchase these tickets. They are rather expensive." The insult was so blatant, so dripping with prejudice, that it was almost surreal. Damien felt a sudden, strange clarity. This was no longer just an unpleasant interaction. It was a test of his leadership, his principles, and his resolve. Before Damien could respond, a new voice joined the fray. "Is there a problem here, Brenda?" It was the lead flight attendant, a woman named Susan, older than Brenda, with kind, intelligent eyes and an air of calm authority. She'd been managing the galley, but the tense standoff in the middle of the cabin had clearly drawn her attention. Brenda straightened up, her expression shifting to one of aggrieved professionalism. "I'm just following protocol, Susan. There's a seating discrepancy. These passengers seem to be confused about their assigned seats." She gestured vaguely towards the back of the plane. "I suspect their tickets are for economy." The word economy was delivered with the same disdain as if she were saying the plague. Susan looked from Brenda's pinched, angry face to Damien's cool, unreadable one. She then looked at Zora, who was now trying to hide behind her father's arm, her small body trembling. Susan's professional smile tightened. "I see," Susan said, her gaze lingering on Zora. She then turned to Damien, her tone respectful. "Sir, I do apologize for any confusion. My name is Susan. I'm the purser on this flight. Could you perhaps just show me your boarding pass on your phone? We can clear this up in a moment." Her approach was everything Brenda's was not. Respectful, de-escalating, and professional. Damien showed her the screen. Susan studied it for a moment, her brow furrowing slightly, not in suspicion, but in confusion. "Blackwood," she murmured, tapping her chin. "That name is familiar." Brenda let out a short, sharp laugh. "Oh, I'm sure it is. Probably on a most wanted list somewhere." The comment was so venomous, so utterly beyond the pale, that a gasp rippled through the nearby seats. Mr. Henderson across the aisle actually winced. The blood drained from Susan's face. That was it. The final line had not just been crossed, it had been obliterated. Damien slowly pulled his phone back. He took a deep breath, letting it out in a long, controlled sigh. The calm he had been projecting was no longer an act. It was a chillingly real stillness, the unnerving quiet in the eye of a hurricane. He looked past Brenda, his gaze landing on Susan. "Susan," he said, his voice soft but carrying the weight of absolute authority. "Could you please do me a favor? Could you get me the sat phone? I need to make a call to our corporate headquarters." Susan blinked, taken aback. "The sat phone, sir. Is it an emergency?" "You could say that," Damien replied, his eyes now locking onto Brenda's. For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty appeared in her cold blue eyes. There's no need for that, Brenda snapped, trying to regain control. I am handling this situation. No, Brenda, you're not, Damien said, standing up to his full height. He wasn't a physically imposing man, but at that moment, he seemed to fill the entire cabin. He exuded an aura of power that had nothing to do with muscle and everything to do with unshakable conviction. You see, there is a discrepancy on this flight, a major one, but it's not with the passengers, it's with the staff. You've accused me of theft, questioned my integrity, and you have terrified my 7-year-old daughter. You have done all of this while wearing the uniform of Aura Airlines. He paused, letting the words hang in the silent cabin. My name is Damien Blackwood, and I own this airline. The silence that followed Damien's declaration was absolute. It was a vacuum, sucking the air and the ambient noise out of the first-class cabin. For a split second, the only sound was the faint hum of the Rolls-Royce engines, a stark contrast to the human drama that had just reached its crescendo. Brenda's face, which had been a mask of smug certainty, crumbled. It was like watching a dam break in slow motion. The color drained away, leaving a pasty, mottled gray. Her mouth opened and closed, but no sound emerged. The clipboard she'd been holding with such self-importance slipped from her nerveless fingers, clattering onto the plush carpet with a muffled thud. The sound was unnaturally loud in the profound quiet. Susan, the purser, stared at Damien, her mind racing. Blackwood. Of course, Damien Blackwood, the reclusive, almost mythical CEO who had bought the airline. She'd seen his name on corporate memos and in the glossy pages of the in-flight magazine's introductory letter. But she'd never seen a photograph. He was notoriously private, and here he was in a gray Henley on his own plane, being harassed by one of her own crew. A cold dread, sharp and swift, washed over her. Mr. Henderson, the passenger across the aisle who had been watching with detached amusement, now looked as if he'd swallowed his tongue. His smug expression had been wiped clean, replaced by a slack-jawed awe. He slowly sank back into his seat, trying to make himself invisible. Damien's gaze never left Brenda. His face was impassive, but his eyes held a fire that was more terrifying than any shouted rage. He had built Aura on a foundation of service, of treating every single person, from the passenger in 34B to the executive in 1A, with dignity. It was the core tenet of the brand. Brenda hadn't just insulted a man. She had desecrated the very idea of the company he had poured his life into. You can't be, Brenda finally stammered, the words tripping over each other. It was a desperate, grasping plea for this reality to be false. I can be, and I am, Damien said, his voice cutting through her disbelief. He then turned his attention to Susan, who was still frozen in place. Susan, please escort this employee to the galley. Have her collect her personal belongings. She is not to interact with another passenger for the remainder of this flight. The order was delivered with the quiet, unquestionable authority of a commander. Susan, jolted out of her shock, nodded quickly. Yes, Mr. Blackwood, of course. She gently took a stunned Brenda by the arm. Brenda, come with me. But Brenda wrenched her arm away, a wild, cornered look in her eyes. The shock was curdling into a desperate, frantic defiance. No! You can't do this. I was following procedure. He looked suspicious. He didn't belong here. The outburst was raw, ugly, and stripped of all pretense. It was the unvarnished prejudice laid bare for everyone to see. Damien felt a pang of pity, not for her, but for the bitterness that had so clearly poisoned her soul. But pity could not and would not stand in the way of accountability. What you call procedure, Brenda, I call bigotry, Damien said, his voice still low but now edged with steel. What you call suspicious, I call a black man traveling with his daughter. You didn't see a passenger who needed assistance. You saw a stereotype, and you used your position, your uniform, my uniform, to humiliate and intimidate him. He gestured around the cabin. My vision for Aura Airlines is an airline where a 7-year-old girl can get a cup of apple juice without her father being treated like a criminal. It's an airline where respect is our cruising altitude. You have failed to meet that standard. In fact, you have flown in the exact opposite direction." He took a step closer, and Brenda flinched. "So, no, I am not just doing this. I am correcting a problem." "Susan," his voice hardened, "if you need assistance from another crew member, please get it. But Brenda's employment with Aura Airlines is terminated. Effective immediately. On the spot. Fired. At 35,000 feet. The finality of it hung in the air, heavier than any judgment. Brenda seemed to finally understand. The fight went out of her, replaced by a terrifying, hollow emptiness. Her shoulders slumped. The helmet of blonde hair seemed to wilt. The formidable, sour-faced flight attendant was gone, and in her place was a broken middle-aged woman in a uniform that no longer belonged to her. This time, when Susan took her arm, she went without protest, stumbling slightly as she was led away toward the galley, her face a blank mask of shock. The other passengers, who had been listening in stunned silence, began to murmur amongst themselves. A woman in seat 3F started a quiet, tentative round of applause, which was quickly joined by a few others. Damien ignored it. He felt no triumph, no satisfaction, just a deep, aching weariness. He sat back down, his body feeling immensely heavy. He turned to Zora, who was watching him with wide, uncertain eyes. He pulled her into a hug, burying his face in her hair, inhaling the sweet, familiar scent of her shampoo. "I'm sorry you had to see that, sweetie," he whispered into her braids. "Is that lady in trouble, Daddy?" Zora asked, her voice muffled against his shirt. "Yes, honey, she is," he said. "She forgot the most important rule, the rule we always talk about." Zora pulled back, her brow furrowed in thought. "Be kind." Damien managed a small smile, his heart aching. "That's the one, baby girl. She forgot to be kind." He settled her back in her seat with her coloring book, but the mood was irrevocably broken. The peace he had sought was shattered. He had asserted his authority. He had enforced his company's values. He had delivered a swift and decisive reckoning. It was, by all accounts, a moment of justice. But as he looked out the window at the clouds streaming past, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was not the end of the story. The fall from grace had been swift and brutal. The landing was yet to come, and he had a terrible premonition that the aftershock of what he'd just done would be far more complicated than the earthquake itself. By the time Flight 765 touched down at JFK, the story was already beginning its digital migration from the confines of the Airbus A321 to the boundless expanse of the Internet. The passenger in 3F, a social media influencer with a modest but engaged following, had discreetly filmed the latter half of the confrontation on her phone. She had posted a 90-second clip to TikTok and Twitter with the caption, "Racist flight attendant gets instant karma from airline CEO she harassed. You have to see this. #Aura Airlines #flying while black #karma." The video was a spark dropped into a tinderbox. Before Damien and Zora had even collected their luggage, the clip had been viewed over 1 million times. By evening, it was the top trending topic on Twitter. Major news outlets, CNN, BBC, Fox News, had picked it up, running segments with titles like "Mile High Meltdown" and "CEO Fires Employee Mid-Air." The story was irresistible. It had a clear hero, a clear villain, and a dramatic, satisfying climax. Damien Blackwood, the mysterious private CEO, was suddenly one of the most famous businessmen in America. Pictures of him, dredged up from old tech conference appearances, were splashed across news sites. His story of building his company from scratch became a symbol of black excellence. He was lauded as a hero, a decisive leader who took a stand against racism. Civil rights activist and attorney Ben Crump tweeted his support. "This is what accountability looks like." At Aura Airlines, CEO Damien Blackwood showed that there is zero tolerance for racism. We need more leaders like him. Richard Branson, the flamboyant head of Virgin Group, praised his actions in a blog post, calling it a masterclass in brand integrity. Aura Airlines stock, after an initial dip from the negative press, soared. Bookings spiked. People wanted to fly with the airline that didn't just talk about values, but enforced them, even at 35,000 feet. The marketing department couldn't have engineered a more potent advertising campaign. Damien had become the face of his own brand, and that face was one of strength, integrity, and justice. But for Brenda, the ripple effect was a tsunami. Her full name, Brenda Schilling, was quickly leaked online. Her photo, culled from a forgotten church bake sale webpage, was plastered everywhere. She became a digital pariah, the latest Karen to be offered up for public sacrifice. Her address, her phone number, her daughter's place of work, all were shared on toxic subreddits and shadowy corners of the web. She was doxxed with a ruthless efficiency that was terrifying to behold. The narrative was simple and brutal. She was a bitter, racist old woman who got what she deserved. Death threats flooded her email. Pizzas she didn't order arrived at her house at all hours of the day and night. Reporters camped out on her lawn. She became a prisoner in her own home, the blinds drawn, the phone unplugged. The world had passed its judgment, and the sentence was a kind of living death. Damien watched the unfolding media storm from the penthouse suite of the Mandarin Oriental, overlooking Central Park. He tried to shield Zora from it, keeping the TVs off and focusing on their vacation. They went to see The Lion King, rode the carousel, and ate towering sundaes at Serendipity 3. But the story was inescapable. It was on the newsstands they passed, the morning shows chattering from televisions in shop windows, and on the phones of people walking by. A part of him, the CEO part, recognized the undeniable benefit to his company. The brand was stronger than ever. But the man, the father, felt a growing unease. The sheer ferocity of the public backlash was unsettling. He had wanted accountability. He had not wanted to unleash this digital mob. He had made a decision to protect his daughter and his company's values, but he had never intended to utterly destroy a woman's life. His unease was compounded by a call he received from Susan, the purser, a few days after the incident. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice hesitant over the phone. "I hope I'm not overstepping. I wanted to say that what you did was right. There's no place for that kind of behavior at Aura. But I've been with the airline for over 20 years. I knew Brenda for 15 of them." Damien listened, his grip tightening on his phone. "Go on, Susan." "She wasn't always like this," Susan said softly. "She used to be one of the best. Warm, funny. The passengers loved her. But over the past few years, she changed. She got hard, bitter. Her husband died about 5 years ago, and then her son. Her son was a pilot for a regional carrier. He was laid off during the pandemic and he took his own life." The words hit Damien like a physical blow. He sank down onto the edge of the plush hotel bed. "I'm not making excuses for her, sir," Susan continued, her voice thick with emotion. "What she said to you and your daughter was unforgivable. But I also know she was under an incredible amount of financial pressure. She was all alone. She'd been complaining for months about the company, about feeling squeezed, about the new cost-cutting measures. She felt invisible, obsolete. I think that bitterness just boiled over. And you, unfortunately, were the one she poured it all over." Damien was silent for a long moment, the glittering lights of the city outside the window seeming to mock him. He had seen the situation in stark black and white. A racist versus a father, a villain versus a hero. But Susan's words had just painted it in shades of agonizing gray. He had been so focused on the what, the undeniable prejudice of her actions, that he had never once considered the why. That night, he couldn't sleep. He stood by the vast window, looking down at the city below, a sprawling, indifferent galaxy of lights. The story the world was celebrating felt hollow. He, the hero CEO, had vanquished the racist flight attendant. Justice had been served. Karma had struck. But as he thought of Brenda, alone in her house, besieged by a world that saw her as a monster, and then thought of her dead son, a pilot like so many he employed, a profound and terrible thought began to take shape in his mind. What if the story wasn't that simple? What if, in his swift and righteous anger, he had missed something vital, What if Brenda Schilling wasn't just a villain? What if she was also a victim? And what if his act of perfect, celebrated justice was, in fact, a terrible, tragic mistake? The ripple effect had made him a hero, but for the first time, Damian Blackwood began to fear he was the one who was truly drowning. The hero narrative began to fray at the edges, not from the outside, but from within Damian himself. Susan's call had planted a seed of doubt, and it grew in the fertile ground of his sleepless nights. He was a man who dealt in facts and figures, in logistics and profit margins. But the human equation was proving to be far more complex than any balance sheet. The twist didn't come from a social media mob or a rival news network. It came from a quiet, unassuming man named Daniel Levinson, a freelance investigative journalist who specialized in the kind of slow, methodical work that rarely made headlines, but often uncovered uncomfortable truths. Levinson wasn't interested in the viral video or the public shaming of Brenda Schilling. He was interested in a series of anonymous tips he'd been receiving for months about safety concerns at a small, third-party maintenance contractor used by Aura Airlines for its East Coast fleet. The tips were detailed, specific, and deeply alarming. And they had all stopped about a week ago. Levinson's investigation led him, circuitously, to Brenda Schilling. He didn't camp on her lawn or shout questions through her mail slot. He found her daughter, a quiet librarian living in a neighboring state, and through her, he managed to get a message to Brenda. He didn't want to talk about the incident on the plane. He wanted to talk about something called Project Nightingale. 2 days later, Levinson was sitting in Brenda Schilling's dimly lit living room. The Brenda he met was not the sneering harpy from the viral video. She was a ghost, gaunt and pale, her eyes red-rimmed and hollowed out by fear and grief. The house smelled of stale air and despair. "Thank you for coming," she whispered, her voice raspy. "I didn't know who else to turn to." "Tell me about Project Nightingale," Levinson said gently, his recorder on the coffee table between them. And so the counter-narrative began to unspool. It was a story not of racism, but of desperation. Brenda's son, David, the pilot who had taken his own life, hadn't just been laid off. In the months before his death, he had been working for the very maintenance contractor Levinson was investigating, Aeromech Solutions. David, a licensed mechanic as well as a pilot, had discovered that Aeromech was systematically cutting corners to meet the demanding cost-saving targets set by its new aggressive client, Aura Airlines. They were using uncertified parts, falsifying maintenance logs, and pressuring mechanics to sign off on work that hadn't been properly completed. David had called it Project Nightingale, after Florence Nightingale, because he believed it was a sick and dying system. He had started documenting everything, collecting evidence, preparing to blow the whistle. He feared that it was only a matter of time before a logbook signature was missed, a faulty part failed, and a plane went down. But the pressure from his superiors at Aeromech was immense. They threatened him, ostracized him, and eventually fired him on a trumped-up charge. Unable to find other work in the industry he loved, buried in debt, and terrified that his silence would lead to a catastrophe, David had fallen into a deep depression. His death was not just a tragedy, it was a casualty of corporate greed. After his death, Brenda had found his files. The grief and rage she felt were incandescent. She had lost her husband, and now her son had been destroyed by the very industry she had given her life to. She saw Aura Airlines, the company demanding the cuts that led to the corruption at Aeromech, as the ultimate villain. She wrote anonymous letters to the FAA. She sent tips to journalists like Levinson. But nothing happened. The system closed ranks. She was just a grieving mother, a flight attendant. Who would listen to her? Her bitterness, the sourness Susan had described, was the corrosive effect of this helpless fury. Every Aura uniform she put on felt like a betrayal of her son. Every cheerful announcement she had to make about our commitment to safety tasted like ash in her mouth. The confrontation with Damian Blackwood was not a random act of prejudice. It was a horribly misguided, desperate gambit. "I saw him," Brenda choked out, tears finally streaming down her face. He was in 2A, a seat often used for deadheading execs. He was a black man, and I know how that sounds, I know. But in my head, it wasn't about his race. It was about his clothes. He looked different. Not like the usual corporate suits. I thought maybe he's not one of them. Maybe he's someone who slipped through, someone who doesn't belong in that seat. And I thought, if I can make a scene, a big one, if I can get myself fired in a way that makes the news, someone will have to investigate. Someone will have to look into my record, my life, and they'll find David's files. They'll find Project Nightingale. It was a plan born of grief and madness, a Hail Mary thrown by a woman with nothing left to lose. She hadn't intended for the racial angle to become the story. She had just wanted to create enough noise to force the world to listen to her son's silent scream. She targeted Damien not because he was black, but because he seemed like an anomaly, an outsider in the sterile world of first class, and therefore the perfect catalyst for chaos. I saw his little girl, she sobbed, her body racked with guilt. I saw her face, and for a second I almost stopped. She looked so sweet. But then I thought of David, my little boy, and I kept going. I said those awful things. I needed him to fire me. I needed the explosion. Levinson sat in stunned silence, the pieces clicking into place. The anonymous tips, David's suicide, Brenda's inexplicable self-destruction on Flight 765. This wasn't a simple story of racism. It was a Shakespearean tragedy of flawed characters, grief, and a catastrophic failure of the system at every level. He published his story a week later. It wasn't on a viral news site, but in a respected long-form journalism outlet. It didn't have a catchy hashtag. The headline was simple: The Whistleblower and the CEO, the hidden story of Aura Airlines Flight 765. The article landed like a depth charge. It didn't exonerate Brenda's actions, but it cast them in a devastating new light. It meticulously detailed the safety violations at Aeromech, backed by the documents David had collected. It told the story of a grieving mother's desperate, twisted attempt to honor her son's memory. The counter-narrative was now public, and it painted Damien Blackwood not as a hero, but as the unwitting antagonist in a much darker and more important story. The man celebrated for cleaning up a mess in his own house was now being accused of ignoring the fire in his basement. The karma that had seemed so swift and satisfying was now circling back, aimed directly at him, threatening to burn his entire empire to the ground. Daniel Levinson's article didn't go viral like the video of Brenda's firing, but its impact was far more profound. It circulated among industry professionals, aviation safety regulators, and the kind of serious-minded investors who read past the headlines. The story changed the conversation from a debate about customer service to a terrifying exposé on corporate negligence. The hero worship that had surrounded Damien evaporated, replaced by a tense, waiting silence. The world was watching to see what the celebrated CEO would do now that his crown was tarnished. Damien read the article in his home office, a minimalist space of glass and steel overlooking a sprawling, manicured lawn where Zora was now playing on a swing set. He read it once, then twice, and then a third time, each word a blow that seemed to knock the air from his lungs. The image of Brenda, wild-eyed and desperate, was superimposed with the image of her son, a young pilot, a young man like so many he felt a responsibility for. He felt a wave of nausea. His swift justice, the act that had defined him in the public eye, now felt like a colossal, arrogant blunder. He had seen a racist and acted. He had failed to see a grieving mother, a desperate whistleblower, a canary in the coal mine of his own company. He had been so sure of his own righteousness that he had become completely blind to the real systemic cancer he was supposed to be fighting. The problem wasn't a single employee's prejudice. It was a rot in the very foundations of his operations. His first calls were to his legal team and his head of operations. "Ground every plane that has been serviced by Aeromech Solutions in the last 18 months, he ordered, his voice devoid of emotion. "Every single one. I don't care if it's Christmas Eve. Nothing flies until we have torn apart and re-inspected every part, every logbook, and sever our contract with them. Immediately. The financial hit would be astronomical. It would likely wipe out all the profit from the last quarter. The board would be furious. But he didn't care. He could see the ghostly image of a plane falling out of the sky, an image born from David Schilling's desperate warnings. His next action was more difficult. He found the contact information for Daniel Levinson and asked for a way to reach Brenda Schilling. He met her not in a corporate boardroom or a lawyer's office, but in a small, neutral ground coffee shop in a quiet suburb. He came alone, with no assistants or attorneys. When he walked in, she flinched, instinctively drawing into herself as if expecting another blow. He saw not a monster, but a woman hollowed out by grief, a woman he had publicly humiliated and privately misjudged. He sat down opposite her, the silence stretching between them. "Brenda," he began, his voice low, "I came here to do something I should have done on that plane. I came here to listen." And so she talked. She told him about David, about his passion for flying, about his integrity. She told him about her fear, her powerlessness, and the insane, desperate plan she had hatched. She cried, not for herself, but for her son. Damien listened to every word. He didn't interrupt. He didn't offer excuses. He simply bore witness to her pain, a pain he had unwittingly compounded. When she was finished, he looked her in the eye. "I am sorry," he said, and the words were not a corporate apology. They were a genuine admission of failure. "I failed. As a CEO, I failed to see the danger within my own company. And as a man, I failed to see the humanity in you. My actions, however justified they seemed at the time, were part of a larger injustice against you and your son. I can't undo what's been done. I can't bring him back, but I can try to make it right." That afternoon, Damien Blackwood held a press conference. It was the first time he had formally addressed the media since becoming CEO. He didn't stand behind a podium. He sat at a simple table, looking directly into the cameras. He did not mince words. He took full, unconditional responsibility for the safety lapses. He announced the grounding of a third of his fleet and the launch of a full-scale internal and external investigation. He announced the creation of the David Schilling Aviation Safety Foundation, an independent body funded with a $50 million endowment from his personal fortune, dedicated to protecting and supporting whistleblowers in the aviation industry. Then he addressed Brenda. "The employee that I fired on Flight 765, he said, his voice steady, was a woman pushed to the brink by a system that failed her. My system. While her actions on that day were wrong, the story behind them is one that we must all learn from. I have offered her her job back, though I suspect she may not want it. Instead, I have asked her, should she be willing, to sit on the board of the new foundation, to help us ensure no other family has to endure what hers has." He ended by looking not at the cameras, but through them, as if speaking to every one of his employees. Aura was founded on the principle of respect. I see now that respect isn't just about how we treat our customers. It's about how we listen to our own people, how we protect those who have the courage to speak truth to power. We failed David Schilling. I failed him. I promise you we will not fail again. The fallout was immense. The stock plummeted. The board demanded his resignation. But Damien held firm. He spent the next year rebuilding. He visited every maintenance hangar. He met with every union. He transformed Aura's corporate culture from one of top-down efficiency to one of bottom-up accountability. Brenda never returned to work as a flight attendant, but she did accept the seat on the Foundation's board. In time, she and Damien formed an unlikely quiet alliance, united by a shared, tragic past. The story of Flight 765 was no longer one of instant karma. It became a cautionary tale, a complex, messy, and deeply human story about the difference between righteousness and true justice, between punishing a person and fixing a problem. Damien Blackwood was no longer the perfect hero CEO. He was something more real and perhaps more valuable. A leader who had been humbled, a man who had faced his own fallibility and chosen not to hide from it, but to learn from it, and in doing so, had finally found the true soul of his company. 3 years passed. 3 years of quiet, relentless work that unfolded far from the glare of breaking news alerts and trending hashtags. The story of Flight 765 had long faded from the public consciousness, replaced by 1,000 other fleeting dramas. But for Damien Blackwood and Brenda Schilling, the story had never ended. It had simply become the foundation of their lives. Aura Airlines survived. It was smaller, leaner, and for a time less profitable. The board, after a contentious battle, had failed to oust Damien. His personal financial commitment and his unyielding public acceptance of responsibility had won over just enough key investors to grant him the time he needed to rebuild. He had transformed the airline with a singular focus. The David Schilling Aviation Safety Foundation was not a PR stunt. It was now the soul of the company's culture. Its anonymous reporting system, which protected and rewarded whistleblowers, had become the gold standard in the industry, adopted by several other carriers. Twice in the last year, credible threats, a batch of faulty turbine blades from a supplier, a procedural blind spot in de-icing, had been identified and neutralized because mechanics felt safe enough to speak up. David Schilling's name was now synonymous not with tragedy, but with prevention. Damien was a changed man. The cool, detached confidence of the reclusive billionaire had been replaced by a grounded, accessible gravitas. He spent more time in hangars than in boardrooms, his expensive suits swapped for functional work jackets. He knew the names of his lead mechanics and their children. He had learned that the strength of his company wasn't in its stock price, but in the trust of the people who held the lives of his passengers in their hands every day. His relationship with Zora, now a bright and perceptive 10-year-old, had deepened. She understood in the way a child can that her father's work was about keeping people safe. She saw the photograph of David Schilling that sat quietly on his desk, and she knew he was the reason why. Brenda's transformation was even more profound. She had become the heart of the foundation. The bitter, brittle woman from Flight 765 was gone, stripped away by purpose. In her place was a fierce, tireless advocate. She had discovered a voice she never knew she had, speaking at aviation conferences and to graduating classes of mechanics and pilots. She told her story, and David's, without varnish. She spoke of her grief, her rage, her terrible, misguided actions on that flight, and the systemic pressures that had led to her son's death. She was a living testament to the human cost of negligence. The work didn't erase her pain, but it gave it meaning. It channeled her bottomless well of a mother's love for a lost son into a force for protection. Honoring David no longer meant tearing something down. It meant building something that would last. The alliance between Damien and Brenda remained a quiet, almost private thing. They co-chaired the Foundation's quarterly meetings. Their interactions were formal, respectful, and deeply efficient. There were no long personal conversations, no shared coffees. The chasm of their first meeting was too wide to ever fully bridge. He was still the man whose company had, however indirectly, led to her son's death. She was still the woman who had used his daughter as a pawn in a desperate gambit. They could never be friends, but they had become something rarer, partners in a shared atonement. They were bound by a debt to the dead and a responsibility to the living. Their mutual respect was forged in the crucible of that shared purpose, and it was stronger than any friendship. The culmination of their work came on a crisp autumn afternoon. They stood on the tarmac of a regional airport to dedicate a new state-of-the-art training center, funded entirely by the Foundation. As Damien finished his remarks, he turned the microphone over to Brenda. She looked out at the crowd of young, eager faces, pilots, mechanics, flight attendants. "My son David loved to fly," she began, her voice clear and steady. He believed that flying was an act of trust. Trust between the passenger and the crew and the mechanics, the company and its people. When that trust is broken, things fall apart. For a long time I was broken, but I stand here today to tell you that trust can be rebuilt. It is rebuilt not with words but with actions. It's rebuilt in the grease on a mechanic's hands, in the diligence of a pilot's pre-flight check, and in the courage to speak up when something is wrong. She paused, her eyes finding Damien's for a brief moment. In that glance, a universe of shared history passed between them, of anger, grief, failure, and redemption. This center, she concluded, is not just a building, it is an inheritance. It is the legacy my son leaves for you. Uphold that trust, be brave, be vigilant, and bring everyone home safely. Later, as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the runway, Damien stood watching the planes take off. Zora, who had accompanied him for the event, came and slipped her hand into his. "That was a good speech," Zora said quietly. "Brenda seems sad but strong." "She is," Damien said, squeezing her hand. "She's one of the strongest people I've ever met." "Is it because of her son?" "Yes," Damien said. "Everything she does, everything we do now is because of him. It's about making sure the story ends the right way." He watched a plane ascend, a silver bird climbing into the darkening sky, its lights blinking a steady, rhythmic pulse. It was just one plane on one evening, but for Damien it was everything. It wasn't a symbol of profit or power anymore. It was a promise to a young man he'd never met, and to a mother he had once wronged. It was the inheritance of a painful past, transformed into a safer future, taking flight. The story of Damien Blackwood and Brenda Schilling is more than just a viral moment. It's a powerful reminder that the truth is rarely black and white. It teaches us that snap judgments, even when they feel righteous, can hide a deeper, more complicated reality. This was a story of systemic failure, of unimaginable grief, and the incredible courage it takes to admit you were wrong, especially when the world is calling you a hero. It forces us to ask, what is true justice? Is it swift public punishment? Or is it the slow, difficult work of listening, understanding, and rebuilding? If this story made you think, if it challenged your perspective, please give this video a like and share it with someone who appreciates stories with depth. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more real-life dramas that explore the complex shades of gray in our world.